All right, we live, some say, in a world of chaos today. Stewart Patrick is an expert on global order at the prestigious Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Here today to explain the shifting global order, what it means, and how we might thrive in it, please welcome to our stage Stewart Patrick on the impact of changing global order in a world of chaos. Have fun.
My friends, I'm afraid that we need to talk about the elephant in the room. I know that many of you came here expecting to hear from Sir Patrick Stewart. Sir Patrick is, of course, a legend of stage and screen and the bane of my existence. I actually changed my Facebook page to his picture for a while, just I gave up. But instead of Jean-Luc Picard or King Lear, you're going to be stuck with me for the next 20 minutes. Rather than Broadway or Hollywood, I work in one of the oldest think tanks. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace was set up in 1910. And you might say to yourself, inauspicious timing for a think tank devoted to world peace and preventing war. But despite the little hiccup of World War I, we've been plugging away ever since, trying to improve international cooperation. Now, Randy Antic gave me quite clear instructions for the talk. He basically said, explain the dismal state of the world. Remember to keep them smiling at the end. We need them to pay to come next year. And so on Thursday, the president will be delivering his State of the Union. I have the enviable job of giving the state of the world, and there's no point in sugarcoating it. The state of the world, from many perspectives, looks pretty bad. Here are a few recent headlines. We face a polycrisis. The world is in disarray. The earth is becoming uninhabitable. We face another Cold War. It's inevitable that we'll have one with China. COVID was just a prequel. We could have had a couple of the earlier talks and say AI will eventually kill us. But any one of these would demand our attention, and yet we have to address so many of these crises at once. Unfortunately, multilateralism is AWOL, and American leadership is uncertain. One of the points that I want to leave you with is really the thesis that stable world orders do not occur on their own. They depend on shared norms and rules and eventually shared law, but they also depend on powers that are willing to enforce and serve as custodians of this order. Sadly, many global institutions are no longer fit for the purpose. Many of them were created at the end of the Second World War, and they're past their sell-by date. In addition, America's own commitment to multilateralism and to international institutions is uncertain at best. In 1945, the United States did something that was really historically unprecedented. It emerged from the Second World War, obviously, with tremendous might, and it used that might not for imperial exploitation, but to actually try to lay the institutional foundations for an open, rule-based international system in which all countries could, at least in principle, join. And that it created institutions like the United Nations and ultimately institutions like NATO. And those institutions, because they had an egalitarian ethos in many respects, they actually helped legitimate American power. That vision became the organizing principle for the free world that helped defeat the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Unfortunately, the US is no longer a reliable leader. In 2016, the American people elected a president who did not believe in the tenets of American internationalism and the precepts of American internationalism. And across the political spectrum, there's much more skepticism than there used to be that we have any stake in global engagement. And there's a tendency that I would argue to hunker down and simply try to handle our own affairs. And I think that this crisis of American internationalism could not come at a worse time because the order that the United States helped create is on the ropes. And I want to look at a few reasons why. First, geopolitics and war are back. The end of the Cold War, as you all remember, was a time of heady optimism, right? The end of history, et cetera. It was optimism about democracy and globalization. international cooperation, the New World Order, as George H.W. Bush called it. As recently as a decade ago, Barack Obama could say that the age of great power competition was a thing of the past. Unfortunately, neither of the two gentlemen in this photo got that memo. And the East-West antagonism has roared back. You see this most obviously in the situation in Ukraine. You obviously see it in the cross-strait tensions with respect to Taiwan, which were featured in Who Controls the Future of AI by an earlier speaker. The incidence of war is also sharply up. Last year there were more than 180 violent conflicts around the world of note. And of course, Gaza being one of the most worrisome and tragic situations that we see today. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council, according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is gridlocked in colossal dysfunction. Relations have also deteriorated between the countries of the so-called global south, that is, major emerging countries and also developing countries, which don't regard the wealthy world as having really any a willingness to make room for them or to pay attention to their concerns. And they have a point. Now, most of these countries, if you look at Brazil and India, for instance, are not rule breakers on the order of Russia. But they're tired of being rule takers, and they want to participate as rule makers. And the question is, will advanced countries let them? The second issue that I want to, the second trend that's really worrisome is that the backlash against globalization is real. We used to believe that hyperglobalization would bind nations ever closer together, that it would lift all boats, and that it would bolster global solidarity. That dream is basically dead, at least for the time being, and it's been buried by the global financial crisis, US-China decoupling, COVID-19, the aftershocks of the war in Ukraine. Citizens and governments around the world are turning their back on the free flow of goods and also the free flow of capital, and are engaging increasingly in nationally focused industrial policy, including in the United States. Now, there are many reasons for this, but the one that I want to talk about is surging economic inequality. Now, recent decades have seen huge wealth creation, and many of us in this room have benefited from that wealth creation. But it is remarkably concentrated. The graph here shows the rise in income inequality in the United States over the past century, and you can see that we're at levels that right before, basically equivalent to right before the Wall Street crash in the Roaring '20s. But it's not just limited to the United States. Earlier, I spoke about the elephant in the room. Here's another elephant, right? This is one by the economist Branko Milanovic, and it shows the relative gains from globalization across all income groups, income levels around the world. The dip in the trunk that you see represents the benefits that accrued, or should I say did not accrue, to the lower middle classes in wealthy economies. This narrow strip, the narrow strip that you see sort of on the right, the trunk going up, now those are the benefits that went to the already wealthy in wealthy countries. Now, I will leave it to philosophers and vicars to pass ethical judgments on this pattern, but I will say as a political scientist that this is a recipe for populism and instability of the sort we've seen in so many advanced market democracies around the world. The third major trend that I want to call attention to is the fact that we are at war with the living planet. Between 1990 and 2020, there was incredible progress against poverty. The percentage of people who lived in extreme poverty fell from 36% to 9% of the global population. That is incredible any way you look at it. Unfortunately, much of that success came at the expense of the natural world, and the bill is coming due. Humans are now the biggest force shaping the Earth system from the atmosphere to the oceans. Last year, which as you know was the hottest on record, we blew by the Paris Agreement Accord, the target of holding the rise in average global temperatures to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. And there is no end in sight as far as that's concerned. As Florida residents, you are already feeling the heat, literally. Hurricanes are getting more violent, sea level is rising, coral is bleaching, just off the coast here, right, just off the beach. The oceans are warmer than they have been in 100,000 years. At that point, 100,000 years ago, they were also 20 to 30 feet higher than they are today. This is not a very high state, I've noticed. They are also 33% more acidic, 33% more acidic than they were 200 years ago at the start of the Industrial Revolution. That is quite something. And meanwhile, critical components of the Earth system, from Antarctic ice shelves and the Arctic, as we saw earlier, and also the Amazon, are approaching critical tipping points that would then accelerate climate change. Biodiversity is also collapsing around the world, jeopardizing many of the benefits that we get from healthy ecosystems and species, like the bees that pollinate our crops or the mangroves that nurture our fisheries. Here's a shocking statistic. 10,000 years ago, humans represented 1% of mammals by biomass, by their total weight, right? Today, that's been flipped. Humans and our domesticated animals represents 99% of mammals by biomass, and the wild species are 1%. This is not, these biodiversity statistics are not necessarily, they're not about tree hugging or whale hugging. They're about what's in your wallet. According to the folks at the World Economic Forum, the guys at Davos, fully 50% of global GDP depends heavily on the benefits that we get from nature. We call it natural capital. And when those services are in decline, we get a lot poorer. So let me move on to our fourth challenge. The fourth challenge is a demographic mismatch. The world is both too old and too young. This is trends in US birth rates. A year ago, of course, humanity topped 8 billion people, up from just 5.3 billion in 1990. It's quite a dramatic rise. But in the wealthy world, of course, what we're much more preoccupied by these days is declining population, because our societies are aging really fast. Present company excluded. You guys look fabulous. In Italy, the average fertility rate, that is births per woman, is 1.24 now. In South Korea, it is 0.84, meaning that the South Korean population will be cut in half by the end of this century if those trend lines don't change. And China, of course, has already started declining in terms of its size. Many aging countries face a fiscal cliff. They don't have enough workers to cover the expenses of the pensioners that are living longer and, thankfully, healthier lives. Meanwhile, in Africa, the continent will see its population double by 2050, when 1 in 4 people will be African, which is quite remarkable. Now, this could be a boon if African countries can harness this demographic dividend. Now, the aspirations of African youth are sky high, and it's becoming an incredible cultural force. It's quite fascinating to see what's going on there. There's a lot of hope, a lot of entrepreneurial energy. But there's also a history of either the world economy or local governments not exactly helping make sure that they can harness a demographic dividend. So there's an obvious way to handle this mismatch, right? You would try, in general, to increase legal migration from the world's poor but young countries to the world's older and richer countries. But of course, the politics of that are almost totally toxic in so many parts of the world. So then the final issue that I want to talk to you about, picking up on many of the things that have been said today, is the risks from technology. As the geniuses who preceded me, and I mean geniuses, who preceded me made clear, we live in a Promethean age. You know, every day we have new gee-whiz technologies, from AI to nanotech, synthetic biology to quantum computing, and the pace of innovation is leaving many of us breathless, or if you're like me, on the phone to your kids asking where the on button is. But it's also leaving, though, I think, governments in the dust. And that is a problem, because if the new technologies can do amazing things, we've already gotten some sense of the incredible risks that they pose, as well as ethical dilemmas. Consider AI and biotech, for instance. Both of them are inherently dual use. That means they can be used for good or for ill, to educate or misinform, to develop a vaccine or the latest superbug. And the fact is that the barriers to entry are really going down, which again is good, but also bad. 2 decades ago, it cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human genome. Today, it can be done for $600, and you can create new life forms in your basement, or it's probably your teenagers doing it. But it's quite remarkable. I'm not going to play this deep fake that Anderson Cooper of CNN showed on CNN, because it pales in comparison to some of the stuff that we saw from Tom Graham and everybody else, particularly when you get to the total weirdness of the text image generation. Moving images are really remarkable. But even when it's used for noble purposes, the unintended consequences are inevitable, like a pathogen escaping from a lab or hallucinations of advanced AI. And I really do want to stress, just picking up on, I guess it was Dan's talk on the strategic implications of all of this, AI will revolutionize and conceivably profoundly disrupt nuclear proliferation and arms control, particularly between the United States, China, and Russia. Over the past year, tens of thousands of technologists signed an open letter warning that AI poses existential threats to humanity. We haven't really talked about this that much. It can seem kind of far out there, but these technologists warn that private labs are locked in an out-of-control race to develop ever more powerful digital minds that no one, not even their creators, can understand, predict, or reliably control. Some people find this exaggerated, but some people believe that the decision point about once artificial general intelligence really begins to take over as to whether or not humans will be able to control it or not is a real thing, and it's something that people are working on at the multilateral level. I want to say that given these trends that I've described, it would be really easy to fall into apocalyptic despair. But this, of course, is the Imagine Solutions Summit, not a Debbie Downer summit. So let's see if we can come up with something. While I cannot propose any breakthrough miracles, I do want to suggest several principles for a more hopeful future. Principles that can advance international cooperation so that we can survive and even thrive on what is becoming a shrinking planet. Here are the first 6 of them. The first, and this may sound prosaic, the first is to remember that we're all in this together. I think this bears repeating, morally and ethically, and not least. But 400 years ago, this very year, the poet John Donne wrote his famous words, "No man is an island." And those words have never been more true. The world is full of problems without passports, as the pandemic showed us. We're more interconnected than ever. And this is true epidemiologically, but it's also true socially, culturally, politically, ecologically, demographically, and technologically. It's also true morally. We cannot afford to be indifferent to what occurs abroad. The second general point is the United States needs to grow up. One of the touchstones of American political culture for a long time has been the sort of thesis of American exceptionalism. It's a touchstone in American political culture. The belief that we're unique among nations, that we have our own special sauce. I think that this conviction is beguiling, and it is not entirely incorrect. However, it can inspire some very dangerous oscillations in U.S. foreign policy. It can have us oscillate between idealistic crusades to remake the world in our own image to isolationist impulses to retreat from an alien world. I think we need to temper this instinct to avoid both overreach, as we saw in Afghanistan, and also chaos by creating vacuums others will fill, which we also saw in Afghanistan. We don't have the luxury of saying, "Stop the world, I want to get off," or slinking into a shell like some hermit crab. We need to commit to enduring and realistic engagement. The third principle is that we need to learn to compartmentalize. It's really tempting when we're dealing with China in particular to take a consistently hard line, as we did with the Soviets during much of the Cold War. But we can't afford to do so because we are so much more entangled with the Chinese than we ever were with the Soviets. We rely on China to help finance our massive debt, to arrest climate change, to prevent nuclear proliferation. We need to cooperate with them on some issues, and we need to compete and deter on others. The same is true for emerging powers, even ones like India and Brazil, which, because they cling to non-alignment, often enrage us. We just need to get more comfortable with, like many relationships these days, people ask you how your relationship is. The answer is it's complicated. Fourth, we need to make room at the top. The US and other Western powers need to make space for rising powers and developing countries in bodies like the UN Security Council and the International Monetary Fund, which were created when many of these countries were colonies. It's hard to give up control, but failing to make reasonable adjustments now will simply undermine the legitimacy of these and lead to major crises. The unipolar moment is over. Instead of doubling down on primacy at enormous expense, the US needs to reinvent multilateralism for the coming multipolar moment. Number 5 is order a la carte and not just prefix. What I mean there is, look, it's really hard to reform major international institutions, formal treaty-based institutions. It can be very hard to do that. That's the prefix menu. So what you have to do is you also have to get nimble diplomatically. And you've actually seen previous administration, Trump administration did it, Biden administration did it, is basically pulling together pickup teams for particular issues. So, for instance, one of the big initiatives that was launched under Trump but is continuing under the Biden administration is the Artemis Accords. It's the next phase of lunar exploration, and as long as countries sign up to these principles, they can be part of the gang. And that way you get the high principles. You deal with the high principles first, and it's quite promising. The 6th point is to pursue growth, but with equity. Rescuing globalization will require building a world economy that frankly rewards labor as much as capital. Yes, many critical decisions that will be taken about levels of taxation or about safety nets are going to be domestic ones. But rules governing the global economy can help enable broadly shared gains. The best shared prosperity in American history were the first 2 decades after 1945, and there were also ones where trade rules benefited lower classes much more than they do now, and countries had more flexibility to pursue progressive social policies than they do now. Let me go to the last couple here. 7th, don't abandon sovereignty, but reimagine it. This is a topic of a book that I wrote, The Sovereignty Wars, a few years ago. A huge obstacle to international cooperation is the nationalist myth that simply by joining multilateral organizations or ratifying international treaties, we're somehow sacrificing sovereignty. In fact, as long as it's done constitutionally, it is an expression and an embodiment of sovereignty. When it comes to climate change, pandemic disease, or nuclear proliferation, the only way to put America first is actually to join with others in common solutions. The only other alternative is to try it alone at huge expense with dubious results where you don't actually affect your fate as a nation. Finally, we need to learn to govern the world as if the earth mattered. You may remember, I certainly do, your first atlas that you ever got as a kid, right? And I was always kind of puzzled by the 2 sort of different maps that you saw in the beginning, right? The first was the big blue marble map, right? The Earth from space. It was basically the planet with no boundaries, really, biogeophysical whole with natural processes. And the second one, almost immediately after, was the geopolitical Earth with borderlines and capital cities. Our environmental emergency is a collision between these 2 worlds, a living planet that obeys no natural boundaries and a political planet divided up into 193 sovereign nations except for Antarctica. We can close this gap, but only if countries accept a solemn obligation to safeguard nature, including parts of the planet like the Amazon, upon which all of us depend. We also need to invest in our Earth's natural capital, habitats, ecosystems, species, in the same way that we do human, financial, and physical capital. It needs to be on our balance sheets, and we need to safeguard it. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought, drawing on my interest in human evolution. More than 30 years ago, I got to spend a couple of summers looking for fossils in Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, in the Great Rift Valley, the cradle of humanity. Here I am, age 23, and undoubtedly a lot more fit, with a replica of one of our cousins on the human family tree, Australopithecus boisei. He's a robust-looking fellow, but believe it or not, a peaceful vegetarian. Our ancestors lived alongside this guy, but they evolved bigger brains. This gave them the capacity to think and to work in think tanks. And it also helped them invent tools like these beautiful hand axes that amazingly still litter the landscape today. If you walk there, you will see them. It's mind-blowing. They're 1 million years old. Along the way, we developed language and complex social behaviors, as well as capacities for empathy and compassion. And these faculties allowed our ancestors to survive in a hostile environment. And this is a story that has been repeated time and again over the last 2 million years. The story of humanity is about our ability as a species to triumph over adversity, often against all odds, by using our tools and by working together. It hasn't always been pretty, but we've managed so far to survive, often, albeit in the words of the play by Thornton Wilder, by the skin of our teeth. On that note of hope, many thanks for your attention, and going back to Jean-Luc Picard, may you live long and prosper. Thank you.